So this talk is called Variable Light Speed in Special Relativity. So with a bit of mathematical manipulation can derive variable light speed in special relativity's maths. In my view, special relativity has been misunderstood. The main reason is the confusing way that Einstein talks about it. Despite all the talk about light speed constancy, in the maths there is variable light speed. And in a previous video I pointed out light speed constancy in relativity is ambiguous. Part of the problem is Einstein has been mistranslated. I'm going to give an example. This is from The Philosophical Problems of Space and Time by Adolf Grunborn. He says, as for Einstein's own view on the dependence of simultaneity on velocity, Perrott and Jeffrey unfortunately mistranslated the pertinent sentence in his original 1905 German paper into English. So he's pointing out that Einstein's relativity has been mistranslated from German into English. And Adolf carries on to say, hence their mistranslation can be mistaken as documentary proof that Einstein himself erroneously asserted that simultaneity can be specified in the special theory of relativity, which is STR, only by stipulating the equality of the to and fro velocities of light. But in Einstein's original German text, he had offered the stipulation of the equality of these one-way velocities as a contextually sufficient condition for simultaneity and not as a necessary condition. So you can read Einstein's paper in German and recognise that it's been mistranslated into English. And this is from a translator's preface to translating Einstein in the collected papers of Albert Einstein. And the translator says, the translator's task was to try to preserve in English Einstein's peculiar style of writing, which reflects the kaleidoscope of his complex thought processes. In other words, Einstein is very difficult to understand. That's if you're reading him in German. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Einstein preferred to write more in the way that he talked in the lecture hall, mentioned with didactic skill every thought to be considered at each step from one formula to the next. Occasionally this taxes even German grammar, which admittedly is more tolerant of very long sentences than, for example, English. Thus the translator put higher value on the tracing of the psychology of Einstein's thought processes historically and didactically than on linguistic elegance, i.e. when Einstein says in German doesn't make sense when translated into English and is very difficult to understand even in German for a German reader. The translator continues, it is well known that Einstein was one of the first physicists to make extensive use of tensor calculus in his numerous papers. Understandably, this was an unfamiliar challenge to the typesetters of scientific journals, and typographical errors were numerous, as every reader of the original has realised. If you look in the original German papers, you'll find it full of typographical errors for the equations. In a text critical edition, these need to be annotated as has been done by the editors in square brackets and by the translator and consultant in curly brackets. The majority of typos are trivial mistakes in subscripted or superscripted indices. This also demonstrates that these errors did not originate with Einstein. So you've got a load of typo errors in the equations, but they're not blaming Einstein for them. No matter what his detractors say, especially those who also had other than truly scientific motives, Einstein, anxious like every author to see his important papers published as soon as possible, perhaps may have been negligent in proofreading, or he wanted to spare the typesetter the then laborious manual work of correcting a printing plate precisely at several cumbersome formulas. And so the typos are still there, i.e. Einstein's papers are full of mathematical mistakes, but don't blame Einstein for that unless you want to blame him for being negligent in proofreading. Based on the corrected translation and going by what the math shows, you have the relativistic factor, which is often called gamma, and it's this equation, and from the square root thing you can manipulate it to write it down as c squared minus v squared by a lot of manipulation. As you can see from here, you can eventually end up with c divided by c, which is equal to 1 for all values of v, and presumably that is not what's meant. So c minus v and c plus v don't equal c, except in the case of when v equals 0. Therefore c minus v and c plus v are variable light speeds, and you can just get it from the maths within special relativity. Hence all this talk with light speed constancy is a space screen. Despite all that talk, the maths has variable light speed in it. And that's the end of this little talk. Thank you.